Welcome to Debut Writers, the podcast that takes you on an inspiring journey through the world of writing and publishing. We are your hosts. I'm Bree.
And I'm Anne. Today we're talking about book ideas. What makes an idea good? And how do you know if it's good?
Lots to discuss today. Lots of really, really good points to get through that I know we'll get into even deeper down the road. But let's go ahead and get started. Actually, let's start with this question before we even talk through all the points that we want to get through. Is it okay to ask other people if your idea is good?
Yes, definitely. I remember when I was debating what my first novel was going to be. I had two really strong ideas, or what I thought were strong ideas. And I remember bouncing off my brother, who is an extremely avid reader. I mean, like to the point where probably reads a book a week. So I knew I could really ask him because he reads just so much. And I said, what idea should I go for? Should I go for, and I kind of explained A Lost Woman to him, and then I explained this other kind of high fantasy book idea I had in mind. And he was like, "Oh, Alabama Tearjerker all the way. Like that's going to be where you shine." I was like, "Okay, awesome." And so therein lies like the beginning of like my focus on A Lost Woman and my ditching of any high fantasy writing, which I've tried to go back to a couple of times and I'm very not good at. So it was a good thing that I went in the other direction. But I think asking people for feedback is a really important thing to do. One of the very first literary agents I ever talked to, she very nicely barely glanced at my work, and she goes, "So, do you have any writing support? Do you go to any communities? Do you have somebody that has read your work before?" And I was like, "No, I've never even told anybody I'm a writer." She was like, "So step one is coming out of the closet and telling people you're a writer, asking their opinion, getting their feedback, those beta readers, critique readers." And she just kind of like slid the book back over to me. And I was like, "Oh, that bad. Okay, thank you."
I feel like that's such a gentle, kind way, though, to
It
help
was.
you do that. But on that note, I think, and we've talked about it before, the first step is actually telling somebody, but it's okay to find just people that you trust, like a couple of
Mhm.
people that you do want to talk to about it. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and tell the whole world or start an Instagram account right away, like that talks about
Yeah.
how you're a writer. Like, you don't have to do that. You can find a couple of people that you really trust and talk to them about what your specific idea is, or if you have multiple ideas. I know that for me with writing, it really started out as like one person and then kind of developed into, okay, I talked to two people now about the ideas, and then three. Just finding the people that you trust. It doesn't have to be the whole world.
Yes, yes. And anytime you can get involved in a writing community and get their opinion, that's always really good too, because other writers are going to be the ones that can give you the best feedback, most likely.
Absolutely. Or avid readers like your brother.
Yes, yes, of course. People who are like really well versed and like this is how people are writing these days. So you got to step it up. Um, I also think too, when as you're kind of developing the idea for your book, it's really important to ask yourself, are you the right person to write this book? So, like with A Lost Woman, there was a lot of emotional background that I could pull on for that book. There was a lot of me put into that book. When they say like write what you know, use your personal background, and that brings kind of that unique and originality to your idea. So you have to know the reason you specifically should be telling this story because we were just talking about this. One of the number one things what makes your idea good is originality, but there are really no new ideas. Everything comes from something. I think Fourth Wing was like comped to Game of Thrones.
And Throne of
And
Glass.
yeah, and like she stole that from them. And I was like, that story has been written 100 times, guys. Like all of us pull inspiration from other authors, other stories, whether we realize it or not, sometimes when we're writing, how much we're pulling from other books and movies. I think I watched that Faith show on Netflix and it was about the fairies.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
But my second installment of The Blood Inside Me, a lot of it takes place at a training school. So I was like, oh, this is perfect. Let me write this down. They did a great job, you
So
know,
Fourth
or I
Wing.
mean, yeah. Or I recently toured a school for my son for middle school, and they have houses like Harry Potter. And I was like, "Ooh, I should put that into my book too." Yeah, yeah, I like this. And so, so we all pull inspiration from everywhere. But what about you makes you unique to write that book? So when you're thinking about, are you retelling, a very common fairy tale? Are you using mythology? Or are you kind of building off, like A Lost Woman is not a unique story, an Alabama tearjerker that's been written 500 times, right? But I brought a very unique space to that book with my knowledge and the way I turned the book and the mother-daughter relation I gave to it. And then, of course, the super twisty ending no one sees coming, hopefully. And so, and I set that apart with a couple other things too. And so that's kind of what we're going to go over today on the podcast is you have an idea, you have some unique reason why you're good to write this idea. It's you're bringing like something innovative to it. You're bringing a different twist to it. And so you've got that idea going for you and you know what makes you unique to tell it. So then what are some of the other things that we need to make sure we have in that book? I think a next thing is that strong concept of you have a very clear and engaging premise that immediately sparks curiosity is crucial. So like that's that opening hook. You've got to have a book hook and you've got to know how to explain your book in like 3 to 4 sentences to where somebody says, I want to read that. I have people pitch me their books all day long, like literally on the street sometimes. My friends, they know I work for a publisher and they're like, oh, hey, Ann, how's it going? I got this great book idea. And then they have to pitch it to me real quick. And I'm like, that sounds interesting. You're welcome to send me your work. Or I just don't think that's the kind way. I just don't think that's a fit for what our publishing company does. That's always like the nice, like, probably not.
I think when you're talking about a strong concept, to keep in mind that for most people, that means that it's been well developed. This isn't just something that you were walking down the street and then it popped into your head. And now I'm going to go up to Anne and be like, I have a book idea.
Yeah.
Like, so a concept is also like it's well developed. It's not going to be strong unless you've taken a couple of other things into account. And most people have thought through those or actually written them out over a period of time. And I'm not saying like I love to walk while I think through what I'm writing or what I'm editing or the book coaching that I'm doing if I'm working with someone specific. But your initial idea, it's not going to be strong, like air quotes, until
Yes.
you actually spend some time developing that. So don't go pitch it the next day when the ideas popped into your head.
Well, and that goes back to that very first agent meeting I had, and I had no idea what I was doing. I was completely unprepared for it, and I missed out on a potential opportunity because I was unprepared for it. So I've heard that too, like get all your stuff ready and prepared to go, and then kind of start putting it out there because opportunities are going to come up, and you don't want to miss being your absolute best at that opportunity. So, developing, and we talk about this kind of in the next series, like what are some of the things you need to do to create the vision as an author and a vision for your book before you start writing? And putting together that book hook is one of probably the hardest and the most important things you're going to do for your book because it will definitely, if you're struggling to put together a book hook and a book pitch, there's something wrong with the plot of your story, I've learned. Because when I was trying to put together for my first Twitter event, and I couldn't come up with a good pitch. A wonderful person on Twitter offered to help me, and she did, and she came up with this amazing pitch. But it made me realize that the stakes in my pitch that's not actually what happens in my book. And so I was like, oh, like the book would probably be better if it did have that. And I went and I added it back in, honestly. I pulled it and I did a rewrite because I realized that the stakes weren't high enough in that book, that there wasn't enough suspense. And so sometimes coming up with that book pitch first can be one of the most important things. And if you're interested in having a little help for that, Bree, I don't know if you know, but there is a lot of AI programs now that are out there being developed. I know it's a controversial topic, but there are AI programs out there being developed to help authors find that book pitch or that query. And to me, it's a really great starting point to get those creative juices flowing. I think the big saying in AI right now is it's not a replacement, it's an enhancement. So don't be afraid to potentially try that kind of stuff out. Test it and see, like, is this good? Should I add a little bit more? It's smarter than I think we all realize, and that's a little terrifying.
A little bit. I think it's important to recognize that it is a tool, and if it's a tool you're comfortable with using, then definitely do it. But just going back to your point, sometimes writing that book pitch first is just going to help with your internal creativity as well. I know I've done the same thing too, where I've maybe outlined something and I think I know where it's going. And then I sit down to write the book pitch and I'm like, oh, wait, that's a lot better. This is actually what I want the story to be. And then kind of shifting to match all of that. I think it's a really good place. But yeah, don't be afraid to use a tool to help you in that process.
Well, and there's a very strict formula when you're writing a book pitch, when you're writing a query. And so if you use the right program, they're using those formulas. And so I know this because I created one, by the way. And so as we're having this conversation right now, it's not completely launched, but once this episode airs, it'll be launched. So I'm excited about that. But it's one of those things where you can even Google, like, how do you write a book pitch? And it'll tell you very strategically the things you'll need to pull out from your story. And that can be really helpful too. Also, understanding your plot. That's really important, making sure you have a well-developed plot for your story. Is there conflict and tension? There's got to be something that's driving that narrative forward. An editor once told me that there's this thread that goes throughout the entire story that pulls the author along. And if at any point that thread, phrase disappears, becomes loose, or just is gone, you lose the reader. And the reader's kind of lost out there. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Why am I still reading this? Where is this going? And so you really have to, and I think that's the tension and the conflict. It's going to pull you through. So what keeps that reader turning the pages and interested in your story? That's really important. And I think that starts with plot development.
Absolutely. And that is something you can go back. I know that I was just working with an author to kind of do that, where we were going through and saying, okay, where does this stall? Where are we losing the people? Mm-hmm. But thinking about that as you're writing is what is going to continue. Everything needs to be very intentional with what you're saying and what you're writing. It has to move that story forward. And I think if you're just sitting down to write for the first time, you may not think about that. So try to keep that in mind as you are like outlining the book or anything like that. What's going to keep pushing it forward, keep the reader engaged.
Yes. And then, so there's that, you got to have that conflict tension, but then also you have to have something I see so often in the books that are submitted to us is our book idea is you focus too much on one thing. Like you're focused too much on the conflict or tension, the world building, the setting, or, the overarching story, and you lose that space of character development. It's always really hard. And that's something that's really important that will set your book idea apart too. Do you have relatable characters? Do you have a diverse level of characters? Because as people are reading your book, there's some core personalities out there. And every reader wants to connect with one character in that story, bare minimum, right? So the more diverse you can have within your characters, the more likely you are to connect with multiple different types of readers. So always kind of keep that in mind too, that readers want to connect on a very emotional level with these characters. So you've got to have them share experiences, struggles, aspirations, have emotional resiliency. That's another really big one too. And if you struggle with that, like I do, and you repeat the same things over and over again about your characters, like I do, pick up the book Emotional Thesaurus. Brie and I recently were introduced to I think Brie already knew about it. I was recently introduced to this book, bought it immediately, and I'm already like just gobbling it up. I'm obsessed with it. It is phenomenal the way it'll tell you how to use words to express emotions without saying it explicitly. So it's more of a show instead of a tell, because people are always saying that in your writing. It's to tell. It's not enough showy. So this book can really help you build that. So I definitely recommend looking into that book. There's a couple of different series books in that series too that can really help you as well.
I would say, just talking about finding relatability too, think about the books that you really have enjoyed or enjoy reading and the characters in them, because you as a reader, whether you realize it or not, are identifying with the characters in some way, shape, or form, or a portion of them or some of them. So think about the characters that you've really liked in the books that you have read, or even the ones that have just been really memorable to you, and that might help spark some of the characteristics that you as a writer are relating to as well, and could really help with your own character development.
I just wrote about this on the inspired writing substacks that I do, about how a lot of times I pull on people I know. I steal their personalities for characters, but it allows me to make them have really rich and deep personalities. And as I'm writing the book, let's say this character has the same personality as my friend Chelsea. I use the name Chelsea as I'm writing the book. But then, of course, when I go into publication, I change that name because I never mix the name with the personality when I actually publish the book. But when I'm writing it, if you have somebody and you're like, I want this character to be just like this person, like that's kind of how I envision them, use that person's name because it'll help you remember as you're writing, okay, well, what, I think, okay, well, what would Chelsea do in this situation? How would she react to this? And it can be really helpful sometimes to kind of, if you're struggling with that character development, ground that character and potentially somebody that's real.
That's such a good tip. All right, let's talk about our genre and audience, because I think that we could spend a whole series just talking about this
Yeah.
for how important it is. And I think as a debut writer is often either not addressed at all or is just looked over. Like, you don't really see how important this piece is when it comes to finishing your book.
And it is so important because when I got done with my first book, and I was like, okay, I need to find a literary agent, right? Well, they request based on genre. So what genre is your book? And I was like, that's a good question. And it took me so long to figure out because it had suspense, but it wasn't really, there wasn't a murder mystery to it. There wasn't like a thriller to it. There was a twist, but it wasn't like a murdery twist or anything like that. And then it was like I ended up landing on women's fiction, which I was really disappointed about because I feel like that underserves it. It really is a domestic suspense, is what I have learned in my deeper knowledge of genres. Of course, that genre doesn't really exist in the general genres. So, like when I would go to pitch the book or try to find an agent specifically looking for domestic suspense, they're not always going to use that term because it's not one of the common genre terms. So, but it can be really hard sometimes, but when you look at your genre, when you go out there into the professional world and you're like, I want to sell my book to an agent, to a publisher, if you don't have a well-defined genre and target audience, no one's going to sign you because it's going to be so hard to market your book. I think some people, Brie and I were just talking about this, they want to have a little bit more of a broader genre or mixed genres together, which mixing genres together can be a tactic that's really helpful. And some agents actually look for that. They want like genre bending or mixed genres between these two genres. Like they want that because it's popular in the moment. But you've really got to understand that the more you can niche your genre and target audience, the more marketability you'll have for the book. Brie and I were talking about the fact that like I am not a fantasy reader. I love watching fantasy, but I'm just not a big fan of reading fantasy books. But Brie loves Sarah J. Maas so much. And she talks about her constantly. She's like, and you've got to read these books, that now I'm going to like pick up her book and read it, which I'm not her target audience. But because her target audience is so strong and devoted and dedicated to her and they love her, she is now reaching people she never would have reached before. But if she just tried to blanket target everybody, that it wouldn't have worked the same way.
It's kind of like that age old saying of, go after the one and then you can reach the many. It's like sales and marketing 101, is that you need to know who your audience is. I would say, even if you're planning to self-publish too, especially if you're a debut writer and you're self-publishing, you're taking, we've talked about it, like you're taking on a lot, and it's certainly doable, and it's an amazing process if you're going to, but you're going to need to know how to market your book. And if you think you're going to market it under a whole host of genres, it's going to be a lot harder than you may realize. I would say, I know you're talking about like some agents are looking for some of that genre bending and the mixed genre, and I think that's there, but there's always this one key element to the book, and then other things are intertwined, and I think that's a real art, and it takes practice to be able to do that. I know that I've been book coaching on a book, and one of the things we initially talked about is I was like, you've incorporated so many genres, but nothing is very focused. It feels muddy.
Yeah.
And I think you need to decide really, where do you want this book to sit? What ultimately do you want that message to be? What's the key takeaway? And then that's going to help guide you to figure out where you want that genre to be. Um, and and that can be hard. Like that can be really hard for some people to figure out. And if you have an idea of that before you start writing, I think ultimately your storytelling is going to be a lot more productive.
Yeah, and I think you've got to think long term too. When you talk to some of these most successful authors, they are writing basically the same book over and over again. I don't know if you noticed, but A.R. Torrey will talk about this and a lot of her trainings that she does. She's a Amazon bestseller, New York Times bestseller. She's self-published originally. Of course, now she doesn't. But she will talk about how you have to pick your genre, and you have to niche it down. And because as you build your audience with that first book, they're going to want the same thing in the next book and the next book and the next book. And if all of a sudden you go from writing like twisty thrillers to a rom-com, they're going to be like, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. I did not come here for a rom-com. And it hit me because I was like, yes, exactly. Like I go to certain authors because I want that genre of book and I know that they can write it well.
Yeah.
I don't stick with an author just because I generally like the writing or something like that. So think about that too. Like as your debut novel is coming out, is this a genre you want to sit in for a while? Are you going to be writing mysteries? Are you going to be writing rom-coms? Like, where is your passion in writing? Because that can really kind of help you say, well, this book's a little rom-commy, but this is my one and done. Like that's how I kind of felt about Lost Woman. It's like my one and done in that genre. So when I actually relaunched the book, I did make it more in that psychological suspense. I changed some details of the story to push it into that genre because my next book coming out sits very heavily in that genre, and that's where I want to sit. So I kind of had to go back and fix that first book so I could really focus on that one genre, because with every book you're building a readership, and that's what you want. You don't want to have to start over every single time because you're switching and hopping genres each time. So that's
Right.
really important to think about too.
It's not impossible, but it is very rare
Well, you
that
have to start all over. You have to know, like
you
like with
do.
my YA fantasy, I have marketing that targets that audience, and then I have
Yep.
marketing that targets my psychological thriller space, and they don't overlap.
No, it is. You're building an entirely different audience, and that's really important. I don't want to name drop the author, but I recently saw someone who has been writing in rom-com for years now, is well known, and all of a sudden she dropped this like kind of fantasy, little bit darker book, and I was so taken aback by it. I was like, that's not why I would go to pick up her book. Like I go to pick up the rom-com. I was so it really does happen that people will want to stick with you because they know what to expect with that.
And if you violate or betray that trust, you could lose them. Like now you're like, maybe I won't be reading that author anymore. Or I'll definitely vet that book a little bit strongly to make sure it's part of the one that I really want, the rom-com, and not this new kind of dark fantasy space.
Right, right, right. Because I know who I go to for that.
Yeah, we do. We do. And so all these things are just super important to be thinking of when you are developing your book idea and kind of thinking about it. So much of your book idea is going to be tied to marketability. So really, really think about that. Consider the market trends and reader preferences. This goes to when you're talking about book covers. You want it to, I always say, you want it to fit into your genre, but also stand out on the shelf next to those books. You know, rom-coms have a very distinct cover right now that they're using. If I use that type of style cover and then it's a twisty thriller, everyone's like, what? Like, that's not what I thought this book was. And when you disappoint a reader, you lose a reader. And you can't get that reader back. And that reader could potentially lose the next 3 readers instead of gaining the next 3 readers for you. Word of mouth is so incredibly important in the reading community. People get together. This is why book clubs still exist pretty heavily. The best marketing, I still feel like, with books, and Bree, you correct me if I'm wrong because this is your space, is that kind of word of mouth, having that really strong core audience out there kind of supporting him. And I'm pretty sure this is how Colleen Hoover got to where she is today.
Yeah, it definitely will. And if you think about, social media when it comes to like book talk and bookstagram too is essentially the word of mouth. If you have one person that can speak really highly of your book and that gets traction, that's what it is. It is word of mouth. I think book clubs, like in person and virtual, are still so apparent because people like to talk about that. And to your point, if you have someone talking about a book or an author enough, you're expanding that audience and expanding that readership. But it all comes through people talking about it. And so it's so important for your overall marketability, what that book looks like, what the title is. On that too, I would say research your title beforehand. Find out if there are other books that are similar or named the same, or even just other companies or organizations out there, because that is all something that you are going to either be competing with or linked to when it comes to marketing your book.
Like if you want to create a pen name, like I did, and you did zero research into the pen name, and you realize there's another author with the exact same name that has produced probably over 30 accounting books very successfully. So anytime you Google Anne Brooks, I mean, she's the one that comes up. And I was like, oh, that's a bummer. I was like, oh, that was bad on my part.
No, I think that's part of what this is helping you all learn from our mistakes or missteps so that you don't make the same ones. And you're probably going to make other things and just you're going to learn from them and continue on and make the next one even bigger. But if we can help you with some of those pitfalls before you really go down the hole, then that's what we want to do,
Yeah.
so that your book can be as successful as possible.
And ultimately, the success of your book idea is going to be a combination of all these factors that we've talked about, plus the author's ability to execute the concept effectively through the skill of your storytelling. So, like, all that's really important. Like I said, you know, with the AI, like it's not replacement, it's enhancement. And so, like, as you are going through this idea, how are you enhancing potentially an old idea? How are you making it unique? How are you the one that's special to tell it? Really focus on all those things, how we've talked about the author's why and your purpose. This is where a lot of that can come out too. And to help you guys, we do have a downloadable sheet with questions to see if your book idea has teeth. So just kind of go through these questions, answer them. It's a lot of what we went over today, and it can kind of help you understand maybe where are you missing something and where do you need, or where maybe are you really strong. And so help you kind of get that idea formulated.
And then next week, we have a very special guest who is joining us. She's an experienced editor with 25 years under her belt, and she's going to talk to us about all that she's been through, how to find your story, how to develop that. It is such a good conversation. Like, we've already talked with her, so be sure to tune in so that you can get her tips and tricks for developing a good book.
And make sure you subscribe in order to get the download this week and the special story development download from Deb next week. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.